Um, we are going to chat today about trauma-informed care practices, specifically working with unaccompanied migrating children. Our hope is that we, as part of the conversation, will have first now a moment to ground and center. And we're not going to go through any major exercise. I'm a mental health therapist by training, and so I will not go into that space. But if you could take a minute to make sure your feet are grounded on the floor as much as you can, and take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and let's try to center and focus as much as we can on this conversation that is important and requires our attention and investment as much as possible, limiting multitasking and focusing what we have in front of us would be much appreciated. And as throughout the conversation, we also invite you to be mindful of your five senses and identify anything, if you need to, throughout the presentation, anything you can see, anything you can hear, anything you can touch, whatever is able to keep you focused and grounded as we are going to start the conversation. Our objectives for the day are simple, but also foundational for the work that we do in engagement and supporting of unaccompanied minors. We hope to share more about trauma and chronic stress and how that manifests in our client population, learn more about the impact of trauma on the brain. We're not going to go deep on neuroscience, but do want to give a general overview of what that means. Some protective factors and resilience traits that we also want to amplify as part of our work. Principles of trauma-informed training, care, and through the training, as well as how to engage and apply them with clients as we go on an everyday life and work as we're doing with this work. And a very brief introduction about healthy boundaries and self-care as anchoring practices in trauma-informed care as a practitioner. We know and recognize that this presentation is based on our experience in our U.S. offices, and that the work and the nuances of it may differ in terms of the regions. And so this presentation, as much as possible, wants to be a catalyst for conversation and a more intentional approach to serving unaccompanied migrating children. But obviously, feel free to adapt or differentiate practices or whatever skills or strategies we introduce to your own context and to your own experience. KIND, as you may know, focuses specifically on supporting unaccompanied migrating children, and our vision is to support them both in their rights and asserting their right in the legal context and immigration law space, but also making sure that their well-being and basic needs as human beings are protected and also nurtured as much as we can. In terms of trauma and chronic stress, we're going to be working with a very practitioners-focused definition, and there are many ways in which we may define trauma. It may be physical trauma if you're in an emergency room in a hospital setting, for example. But for us, we're going to refer to trauma as just a series of events or circumstances where an individual is, whether it's physically or emotionally, in a very heightened harmful situation or life-threatening situation, and that has a lasting adverse effect on that individual's functioning and well-being. It is worth mentioning that children have a much amplified analysis of what danger means and what threats mean to them. So for an experience that may seem to an adult very commonsensical and not necessarily anyway life-threatening, to a child that may be completely different because of their cognitive and developmental lenses. And it's important to keep that in mind as we're speaking about childhood trauma, because some of the experience that we as adults may be able to navigate in life, it's not the same for children. Chronic stress is a consistent feeling of being pressured and overwhelmed and overextended over a period of time, and having that consistent pressure and exposure to situations that may be perceived or are in fact life-threatening can very much deteriorate someone's ability to cope and navigate life, especially if that happens early in life. And in both cases, both in trauma and chronic stress, the brain is highly activated and tries to manage the perceived threat in different ways. And that's why it's important to make sure that when we are engaging with children, we have the context of what their experiences have been and how they make sense of those experiences, rather than making our own analysis of whether or not that was a threatening experience for a child. In terms of our clients' lived experiences, there are multiple events and circumstances that can lead to stress and chronic stress and trauma in UCs, unaccompanied children's lives. There are the aspects of in-home country elements during migration, as well as in the host country or new country integration. And as you can see here on this chart, there may be layered in different ways, whether it's basic needs such as poverty or safety and violence, neglect, and transient caregivers for one reason or another, not having adults that can protect and support them in their growth, as well as during the journey, which can be a very destabilizing and traumatic experience for many children, many times even higher than what they may have perceived in home country. And then in the new country, the elements, the social, emotional, or psychosocial impact of having to integrate to a new environment, a new way of life, in a possible not so welcoming and at times potentially hostile patterns of integration, also brings a lot of instability and emotional distress to children. And as we know, ongoing geopolitical disruptions may lead to children's increased vulnerability and decreased protective factors, forcing them to migrate. So there may be many layers that exacerbate the in-home country reasons for migrating, and then the journey as well in terms of geopolitical elements that children have to face. And part of that is the historical aspect of trauma as well. Historical trauma is intergenerational trauma, and it is experienced by individuals in different ways. The emotional and psychological impact of trauma across generations is very palpable in children that have experienced vulnerabilities even in the womb. And research shows very clearly that attachment as well as general cognitive and developmental elements can be impacted depending on the caregivers or parental trauma exposure in children in the womb as well as in early childhood. And we can see that trauma can lead to attachment disruption or challenges, both with parental figures as well as with practitioners or caregivers in other settings, diminished caregiver functioning, which inevitably may lead to neglect and just not having enough protective factors around a child, as well as in clients themselves, executive functioning impact and the ability to make decisions and think about consequences before actions that can also be impacted. And as you can see in terms of the graphic on the right, how caregivers' trauma can impact a child's development, it is a very clear link between a child's exposure to trauma as well as the caregivers or parental figure in their lives. The brain, speaking of the brain and how that trauma and that environment of vulnerability impacts the brain, our brains develop from the bottom up, from the stem to the prefrontal cortex. And in between that progression, we have very specific ways in which trauma can affect neurodevelopmental progress and even redirect some of the brain's allocation of resources or support, or in the way in which the brain responds to certain circumstances, especially when children are exposed to traumatic experiences either in the womb or very early childhood in prior to 5 years old. We can see how, for example, the amygdala, which is the area that's wired for survival, that basically the alarm system or the smoke detector of the brain takes over, and it has a faster response rate than the other areas of the brain, and therefore takes over in the response to any traumatic experience. That's why there's not a lot of thinking, there's not a lot of rational decision-making kind of pros and cons list when one is responding to a traumatic experience, because the amygdala is in that survival mode and is activating our response so that we can be safe rather than thinking of consequences or actions. And when that pattern is established, it can be perpetuated later on in instances where someone is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, where it is activated in ways that are not necessarily logical. I heard there's a psychiatrist out of the Bellevue Hospital in New York City that described trauma once as being in a library or being in front of a big bookshelf, and trauma coming and shuffling all the books out and not having the ability, we putting it back on the shelves, but in an order that is at times surprising, where you may be looking for a book in the nonfiction section and happen to find the cooking book there, and that triggers you. And that's similar to that ability to catalog information in a very logical and consistent way that is disturbed and disrupted in a way when we're facing trauma or traumatic experiences and the brain responds to it. The National Traumatic Stress Network in the US and CTSN has a very comprehensive list of potential experiences that can impact a child's development and labeled as trauma. And as you can see on this slide, that is a very wide spectrum, ranging from bullying to traumatic grief. And again, bullying to an adult may not necessarily carry the same level of risk that it may be for a child that thinks that they actually are going to be harmed in a very clear way if they do not follow the bullies or the whoever is pressuring them. And we want to make sure that as we contextualize the experiences of our clients, we do so from their lens and how magnified or augmented that can be for them. There is a lot of different ways in which memory, especially as we're speaking of the legal work that is done with clients and to support them and what it requires to elicit information from clients and rehashing and living memories that may be traumatic for them. There are different areas of memory of our memory that is impacted, from semantic memory, which allows us to our ability to have general facts and knowledge, to our episodic memory, which is one that focuses more on facts and autobiographical elements of the experience, as well as emotional memory, which is how we feel and the different emotions that we face when we are experiencing something, as well as procedural memory, which is how we sequence different things without having to necessarily intentionally think about them. And as you can see by this graph, there are different ways in which the brain interacts and is impacted with information and or in a traumatic event, and it may impact a lot of what a young person is able to bring back or elicit as part of their memory and what they think of that event, what happened to them, the people involved, what exactly were the facts in that instance. Sometimes it's difficult for them to recall those. And inevitably, the legal process is counterintuitive to that. It requires a lot of specificity. It requires a lot of honing in on details to make sure that the arguments and the information is as clear as possible and is diametrically opposed to what a young person may be able to actually do given their experiences, and working with them to be able to navigate those limitations and supporting still the work that we're doing. It's important, and making sure that we always go back and try to not necessarily re-trigger or hone in specific pieces of information, but give the client the opportunity to recall things in a manner that may not necessarily be as impacting as we maybe are used to in a traditional legal setting, working with adults, for example. Some key protective factors, we have found that children in the US that we work with respond well to interventions that foster resilience, that are very strength-based, and that are also very, very culturally responsive. To be able to engage with children, we also have to make sense of their work, their world, so that our work makes sense for them, in addition to making sure that we have very grounding and anchoring elements to the relationship. We believe that having supportive adult relationships supports children greatly. Fostering a sense of self-efficacy and perceived control. Trauma takes away a lot of our control, a lot of our ability to make sense of the world. It isolates us, and therefore having that back to a client may make a world of a difference, both in their lives in general, but also in our relationship and our ability to work with them. Making sure that we have adaptive skills and allow for self-regulation when possible and opportunities to do that, as well as mobilizing the very anchoring elements of a child's cosmovision or how they see the world, having faith, hope, cultural traditions that maybe aids in how we engage with them. And the graph on the right is just a reminder that it is helpful to have a what we call in social work or in human services, an ecosystemic approach, making sure that we remember that children do not operate in a vacuum. They are unable to operate in a vacuum because they do not see the world in that way. Children are a lot more integrated. That's why they speak about superheroes in the same sentence as schoolwork. And even though it doesn't make a lot of sense, it's because their world is much integrated than ours. And our approach has to be very ecosystemic, meaning that we need to take into account the different systems and people and areas that come in contact with a child, and as much as we can strengthen the connections to those by our relationship. As a legal advocate, as an attorney working with a young person, interacting with the immigration law context and systems, we are a role model and a supportive adult. And for some of our clients, even coming into our offices, which may be very different from their everyday spaces, creates a world of a difference and an ability to see their world in a very different way. And ensuring that we can do that as much as we can is key. I'm going to pass it to Virginia, who's now is going to take care of the next part of our presentation.
Thank you, Yaciel. Hello, everybody. Now in this second part of the presentation, we are going to provide some recommendations, some best practices when working with traumatized clients. But before we do that, we want to review the principles of trauma-informed care, the 6 principles that you have here. Something also important for you to consider is that the principles of trauma-informed care apply to all layers in the organization. That means that this applies to our clients, but this also applies to service staff. Okay, so we have the first principle, that it is safety. So this principle means that in an organization, everybody, staff and clients, all of us should be feeling safe emotionally and physically. Then we have the principle of trustworthiness and transparency. According to this principle, all the practices, the decisions, the operations, the policies within an organization must be taken with transparency, because the goal is to build trust among clients and staff. Then we have the principle of peer support. The term peer here refers to individuals with life experiences of trauma. And this principle is about integrating the values and the culture of peer support into the organization. Then we have the principle of collaboration and mutuality. The organization recognizes that everybody has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach. Will we say that you don't need to be a therapist to be therapeutic? Then we have the principle of empowerment, voice and choice. We recognize the strength of the clients and also the staff of the agency. And we acknowledge that each experience is unique. And because each experience is unique, this requires also an individualized approach. And this includes believing in resilience and the capacity of people to recover from trauma. And the last principle is cultural, historical, and gender issues. And this means that we need to overcome stereotypes. And we do this by being culturally humble and by offering culturally responsive services to our clients. So a key objective in trauma-informed care is to prevent re-traumatization generated by intervention practices and policies. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this concept of re-traumatization. This re-traumatization actually happens when someone who has suffered trauma re-experiences the role of a victim as a result of reliving or remembering the painful moments or emotions that are associated with the traumatic experience that they had. So this occurs, for example, when we think about our client population, when our clients are asked like many different times and by different individuals to repeat the same story of the traumatic events all over again, right? So in the next slide, we are going to be providing some tips on how to prevent re-traumatization. So we can practice trauma-informed care, for example, during our clients' meetings, right? So the first thing that we are going to be doing is to create a safe environment. We are going to ensure that the location is accessible, appropriate, and private. So ideally, we will be meeting our client in our office. We know that this is not always possible. It's not always going to be the case, unfortunately. So if we cannot do that, we are going to try to meet the client in a public space that also offers some private rooms. So within that, a good example could be a public library. If this is also not possible, again, we are going to try to meet the client in a space that it doesn't make the client to be more vulnerable, right? We will offer water and breaks as many times as we feel that the client might need it. So a strategy that we might want to have is to just have some glasses and some water on the table when we are meeting the client. If we feel that the client cannot continue the conversation, we are going to offer to stop. We are going to offer some water. We can also practice some breathing techniques with the client. It can be something very simple, right? So we can just say, okay, we are going to breathe in and breathe out 3 times together, right? We are going to drink some water. We are going to take 5 to 10 minutes. So let's see if the client can relax and continue the conversation with us. And we will explain our role and the process multiple times and as many as needed. So keep in mind that we work with children or with youth, so we know that perhaps this is the first time that they are meeting an attorney or a paralegal or even a social worker, so they might not be familiar with our role. So it will be good if you can give them some like real examples. For example, in the case of social services, in our case, we also try to explain that we are not attorneys, that we are not accompanying them to the court, that we are not helping filling out their legal paperwork. And we explain that we do other kind of things and we can help with other kind of needs. And we might say, I can help you enroll in a school, I can help you make an appointment to the doctor, I can help with some other things. So we will explain, everybody will be explaining this, all the people involved in the agency with the client will be explaining this. We will emphasize transparency, trustworthiness, and choice. Likewise, we will provide the contact information for us and for others in the organization that might be involved with the clients. We will also allow the client where to sit. Something that might look very simple, right? Like it doesn't matter where somebody sits. Well, it can matter. So we know that our clients most of them are very traumatized, right? So keep in mind that perhaps they don't want to sit near the door, right? Because they know that perhaps somebody will enter suddenly and they might get scared and they don't want to go through that. Or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps they want to be seated near the door because if something comes up, they know that they can just go away and get out quickly, right? So the key here, I think, is that to recognize the pattern, but to not take anything for granted and to always try to give agency to your client and give them choice if possible, even if it's with something as simple as where to sit, right? And we would like time for questions. We can do this at the end of the conversation. Something that happens very often and with many clients is that they don't have questions. Again, we work with children, we work with youth. It might be very overwhelming, all the information, legal information or social services information that we are providing to them, and that might be the reason they don't have any questions. So at the end of the conversation, we can always say something along these lines and say, I know that I have given you a lot of information that you need time to process. If you go back home later and start thinking about this conversation, if you have any questions, any concerns, please know that you can always text me or calling me the following day. This is my schedule. I'll do my best to reply to you within working hours the following day. Something like this will give the client some reassurance, right? That we are there for them to always answer any questions that they might have. And we will respond with patient and proactive support. So be aware of your body language and your tone, your pace. So what is my body language saying to the client? It might say that I'm anxious. It might say that I'm uncomfortable. It might say that I'm in a rush to finish the conversation. So always try to project some calm to the client, right? So try to not speak too fast. Try to have some rhythm in your voice because we're again talking to children, and also try to adjust your vocabulary. Even if you are bilingual and speak the client's language, we work with children, we work with youth, so we know that we need to adjust our vocabulary. So keep in mind your audience and the age of your audience. And then we will summarize content and next steps. We can do this also at the end of the conversation, and it will give them, the clients, like what they can expect, right? So they will know what they can expect from us and also from the process. And we will offer connections to community resources and other supports. If throughout the conversation we feel that the client has any other needs, we can connect the client perhaps to a social worker, or we can something as simple as just to provide crisis hotlines. That might be very helpful for the client if we can provide some of these resources, right? And we can also start developing some, or kind of like having new conversation techniques to practice trauma-informed care. We will always try to use a variety of short questions. So we will start and end with light of neutral or neutral topics in our conversations with clients. So we do this at the beginning of the conversation with the client because we want to break the ice, right? So in the case of, for example, social services, we don't want to start any conversation with a client talking about mental health therapy, right? So we are going to start breaking the ice. We can just ask, if it is the first time that we are meeting a client, we can just talk about the weather. We can just say that the weather is very nice today. What kind of things do you like to do when the weather is nice? Do you like to do something outdoors? And if it's not the first time that we are meeting that client, if we have met the client before, we can try to bring back something in a previous that the client mentioned in a previous conversation. For example, if they mentioned that they like playing football, we can ask, have you played any game lately? Or have you watched any game on TV? Something like that is going to help us to break the ice and to help the client feel comfortable, which is most important. When possible, we will use what and how in our questions instead of why. So this will require us to kind of like reword the question. The reason we are doing this is because why questions are considered and understood like very sharp, very critical, very accusing. And if this is the way the client is taking the question, what is going to happen is that the client is going to activate their defense mechanism. And what is probably going to happen is that they are going to shut down and to block out. I know that this requires a lot of practice, but try to kind of like introduce this technique slowly within your repertoire. And we will end again with a neutral question, such as what are you going to eat later? Or do you have any plans for lunch? And we do this also in the same way that we did at the beginning to break the ice. At the end of the conversation, we are doing this also to tone down the conversation, right? And transitions, we will make clear transitions from one category to the next. So you remember that a few minutes ago, Yasil told us how trauma impacts the brain, right? So we know that our clients have difficulties remembering events and that they have difficulties organizing events in chronological order. So making these clear transitions are always going to help our clients. We do this, for example, in the case of the attorneys or the paralegals, if you are working on an asylum declaration, and you want to make these transitions, for example, talking about how was their life in their home country and explaining to them, okay, we now just finished talking about this, about how was your life in your home country. Let's talk about your trip. How was your trip until you came to this country? And then again, after you finish that, you want to open a new blog. We do something similar in social services when we talk to our clients and we talk about their needs, when we assess their needs. So we perhaps also do like an assessment and we start, for example, with their living arrangement. After that, we might ask them about education. After that, we might ask them about their medical needs and also about their mental health needs. So we kind of like try to make these transitions and to make it clear for them because of how the trauma can impact the brain. And we will always communicate with empathy. So we just listed some examples here of some things that you can always say to your client. The key here is always to validate their feelings and to normalize. There are just 3 examples here. I'm sure that you all have your own and that you can come with something better on your own, but you can say something like, it makes sense that you feel that way. Other people going through that tend to feel the same. I'm hearing that you say that you feel sad, and always please also thank you, the client, for trusting us and for telling us what they are telling us, okay? And now we are going to talk about healthy boundaries and how to create safety. A key aspect in our relationship with our clients are to establish healthy limits. But let's review also some definitions here on the left. So we have trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is an approach in the human service field that assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. And this is an approach that recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges that the role that trauma may play in an individual's life, including service staff. So these take us back to what I explained before, right? With the 6 principles of trauma-informed care and how everything should be considered within the organization, how can impact to clients and also to service staff. And then we have boundaries. Boundaries are a set of rules, guidelines, and expectations established in a professional relationship to minimize worker-client power differential, vulnerability, and potential harm. It is the framework for a healthy working relationship of trust. But how do we do this, right? How can we set healthy boundaries? Well, the key to set healthy boundaries is always balance, right? So we don't want to be in any of these extremes that you can see here. So we don't want to have a relationship with our client that it is too strict in a way that the client might think that we are not responsive or that we are not reliable or that they cannot trust us or that they are not even going to help. But we don't want to have a relationship with the client that is in the opposite way of the spectrum. We don't want to have a relationship with the client that it is tangled and confusing for them in a way that they might think that we are kind of like a parent or a friend or even a partner, because we know that we are never going to have any of these roles, right? So what we need to do is to have this balance and to reach like a middle ground. So we have to be empathetic with the client. They have to perceive our worth, that they can trust us, that we are here to help them with their legal case, but also with their non-legal needs, right? But always maintaining a professional relationship and without them thinking again that we are going to have the role of a parent or a friend, because that's something that is never going to happen. So let's look at some ways that we can set healthy boundaries. So to set healthy boundaries, the first step will always to review confidentiality with the client. So the recommendation here is just talking about confidentiality. What is confidentiality? And if there is any limit to our confidentiality in our work with client regarding of our role, if we are attorneys or if we are social workers, that's something that we need to explain to the client from the very beginning. And we will also avoid disclosing excessive personal information because we know that we can be empathetic without disclosing too much, right? We'll set parameters also for communication and meetings. So again, if we can give the client choice and agency, we are gonna do it. So we can ask the client, what's their preference? Do they prefer for us to communicate through SMS or do they prefer WhatsApp? So we can just adjust and we can go their way, but it will be also important for us to set boundaries and expectations and to explain to the client when it's important to talk over the phone and not by text. What kind of conversations are better in person and not over the phone and by text again. And try your best to communicate only during working hours. We all make exemptions. We all have clients who are in a school or clients who finish work at 7 p.m. And even if our schedule is 9 to 5, we are always going to make those exceptions. But try to stick to your working hours, to your schedule if possible. So a good strategy could be using like away messages on WhatsApp, remembering the client that your schedule is 9 to 5, listing some crisis call lines, and remembering the client that you will give them a call or you will be in contact as soon as you go back to the office. And we will give the client resources for emergency situations. In this case, I mean, it could be appropriate again to provide crisis hotlines, or we have like a list of resources. So the idea will be, if I know that my client is vulnerable, it will be to be ahead of the crisis and to be proactive. And lastly, we will be aware of the space. Always ask before getting close to client, because how close is too close, right? So we don't know. So the best way we know that our clients, again, will recognize the patterns, right? So we know that many of our clients have been are survivors of sexual abuse or physical abuse. So and because we know that there is a pattern there, we are always going to try to not take anything for granted. So before being too close, we are always going to ask the client. And we are going also, we will be also asking about their preferences. Do they go by their first name? Do they go by their middle name? What are their pronouns? Do they identify as he, she, they? We don't know. So the best way to know, it will be always asking the client. And we will avoid meeting clients alone or in vulnerable spaces. We talk about this at the beginning. So it will be better to meet in public spaces, even if it's not the office. And if needed, you can also ask a colleague to be nearby, so you won't be alone with the client. So we want to talk about self-care briefly today. You know, like professionals like us who are exposed to our clients' stories of traumatic events, we can also develop a stress response or negative emotions and behaviors known as vicarious trauma, or also known as secondary trauma. The thing is that we actually tend to put aside our own needs in order to help other people. And the reality is that to be present to our clients and to be empathetic with them, we need to work on our own well-being. So, and this is why it is important to pay attention to self-care and to recognize that self-care is trauma-informed care. So breaks, we will recommend you to take breaks for yourself, especially to disconnect from heavy content. If you have a 1-hour conversation with one of your clients, if you have been talking with a client about their experiences in their home country, all these traumatic events that we mentioned before, after that, try to take like 10 minutes, go outside. We used to do this before the pandemic, right? Try to go outside, meet your colleagues, take a coffee, try to disconnect a little bit from that content, right? And if you find this difficult, consider why. Try to do some self-reflection, why I'm not able to take any break, right, at work. And physical sensations, use your body as a guide. What is my body telling me? Do I have any neck pain, the back, something that might be saying that I need to keep taking these breaks or take any time off at work, any sick day to kind of like recover or to feel better. And use movement to reset through the day, okay? Try to walk again, try to get outdoors a little bit if the weather allows. Time for processing. Do a lot of, that's one of my main recommendations for you will be doing a lot of self-reflection. Acknowledge how this work impacts in you, reflect on what gives you hope. And we're about to finish this training, but we don't want actually to end without kind of like stopping in this concept of resilience. Because despite the many challenges that our clients face, they display perseverance, resilience, and capacity for hope on a regular basis. So resilience is actually, most of you will be familiar with this concept as well. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, which we know that is especially true when it comes to our client population, right? And after they have experienced so many adversities and traumatic events. So I would like to invite you all after this training to do a little bit of this self-reflection, right? And to think about examples of situations that you have witnessed among your clients and good examples of resilience among your clients, or perhaps among the staff that you work with, among your coworkers. So I just want to share one example about our clients. Kind usually every year runs a communication campaign in June. And we like to highlight the stories of some of our clients when they graduate high school. And we feel that that is an amazing example of resilience. These kids come to this country without speaking any English at all. They are able to overcome that and all the traumatic events that they went before, and they are able to come here. Amazing. So that's an example that I just wanted to give you. But again, I would like to invite you to do some self-reflection and to end this training thinking about this good thing, which is the resilience among your clients. And we have just finished this training. We would also like to extend our appreciation for all the work that you do to support unaccompanied migrant children and youth in Europe. And thank you for your investment of time, expertise, and relationship.
Thanks, Virginia. We have a time for questions and answers, or any comments or reactions that you may want to share to some of the information we have shared. Again, this work is pivotal for the health and well-being of so many children who are in such vulnerable spaces and having to leave everything that they know to migrate to safety. Many times to reunify with the only caregivers that they have available, or to start with a completely new set of adults around them to support them. And having you all and us together as advocates to support them makes a world of a difference for them, and really heightens our chances to be able to be grounded, positive contributor members to the societies in which they live, and to enrich also our social fabric as communities in general. We very much appreciate your partnership in supporting these children, and welcome your questions or answers, or any questions or comments that you may want to share in the chat.
We see one question, and really it's a big thank you to the both of you, and I'll come in and echo that. Thank you so much for sharing such expertise, and it was so helpful. I very much wish that I'd had something like this when I first set out to represent unaccompanied children many years ago. So thank you so much. I'll just monitor. No, I think it's just a lot of thank yous at the minute, which is lovely to hear.
I do see one question actually, Kirsty, in the chat. I think from Andy Ferguson. And do we have any tips for holding a comfortable meeting with clients online as opposed to in person? That is an excellent question, especially in our post-COVID world, as we're engaging more and more like this. I would say, and Virginia, please chime in as well. I would say that one of the main things to keep in mind is to be aware of client resources. For us, it may be very natural to have a working computer, a working internet connection, a space that is noise-free, or as noise-free as you can have it if you have children around of your own. And that is a given for many of us. That is not so for our clients and for the families that we may be working with. Before establishing that as a standard to engage with clients, it's important to do those check assessments. Do you have a way to connect actually? Do you have a phone that works? Many clients rely on free Wi-Fi connections, for example, in the US, because if they do not have the funds to pay for a phone, then they may not be able to actually have a meeting with video conferencing in it. And so being mindful of the environmental factors that can do that, as well as the fact that children just do not necessarily communicate well in this very face value medium, right? Children do not, a child, depending on their development, until they are in mid-teenagehood, they're not really able to grasp abstract information very well. And a smiling adult, for example, is a nice person. Doesn't matter if that person is coming to harm you. If they're smiling, oh, they look like a nice person. They don't necessarily have that level of analysis, ability to analyze information in that way. And this medium, as we know, may be very limited, depending on how information is conveyed and whatnot. And making sure also confidentiality is key. When you meet online, you don't necessarily have a foolproof ability to make sure that no one else is listening to the conversation or influencing the child, forcing them to say something that you can't see. And it's important for you to be mindful of that as well. Virginia, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
I mean, I agree with everything that you said. I think from my perspective, the big change during the pandemic was the last piece that you mentioned about privacy. So we noticed many times in our conversation with the client that there were other family members around in the conversation in the same room, or they are sharing the house with many other families, right? So try to be patient. So if you are hearing some voices, if you are kind of feeling that there are other people in the room and this conversation requires privacy, so always tell the client it is okay. You can say that something along the lines that, oh, I see that there are other people around and you might want to be, discussing this with me alone. If the client has, is a teen or something, so you can say, I can wait if you want to find another room, or we can reschedule this for later today. So offer them always options, so to see if they are feeling more comfortable with another situation. But apart from that, most of the examples that we share, I think that are going to work, right? Because even if you are having an online conversation, you are going to be able to see if the client is breaking, right? If they cannot continue with the conversation, if they need to take some breaks, if they need to drink some water. So most of these things are going to apply. And at the end, you can keep creating this safe environment, even if it's online and it is not in person. I think that you can still create that environment, that safe place for them.
That's great. There's another very important question, I think, in the chat. Do you have any recommendations for what steps to take when a young person becomes emotionally distressed? I think that we have to be, my quick answer, which I was typing in the chat actually, was allow for space for the young person to go through the feelings that they are experiencing as much as possible, and validate the fact that that is a normal response to whatever information they may be sharing, or whichever situation. Many times having a quick fix can be dismissive, and that was kind of my quick response in the chat. The other thing is that it's difficult unless you're a mental health or a helping professional that's trained to self-regulate in the face of another person experiencing distress, it is very difficult. It's important for you to give yourself time to also respond. Sometimes in our desire to support someone, we are very reactive in how we respond, and that inevitably may actually hinder the person just letting it out and then centering themselves again. And also you to be able to develop the skills that you need to sit in the discomfort with another human being. And so obviously, absent having training on how to do that, it's important for you to exercise grace and patience with yourself. If you do not know how to respond to a young person that is in distress, it may just be enough to sit there and witness to that and give some water and pass a tissue and be there, and then say, it seems like, as Virginia mentioned before, it seems like this is a difficult situation and a sad, and you're feeling sad. Is that the case? Is there anything that we can do? Maybe breathing exercises are excellent. So if you could have, in your hip pocket kind of toolkit, one quick breathing exercise where you're like, well, let's pretend, if it's a very young child, let's pretend that we are a balloon and fill up and then let it all out. How fun is that, right? Or if it's a younger person, say, it seems like we're having a difficult time in this space right now. Why don't we breathe in and out for a couple of times to see if that helps us? So having very quick strategies that you can put into place is important. But my number one caution is, do not try to quote unquote fix it, because many times trying to fix it may come across as you not really validating the fact that this is very difficult to engage with as an individual. And it's not easy to put yourself on display and all your vulnerabilities, even if you're 8 years old.
Yeah, I echo everything that Yaciel said. I think that we don't obviously need to be a therapist to practice these breathing techniques. You can do some research online and you can perhaps, like, again, breaks, water, breathing techniques. Some of them are very, very simple. You don't need to be a therapist or a psychologist to implement this. And also try to see if this opens the conversation with the client in the future to talk about mental health therapy. I wouldn't recommend you to offer this to the client during this conversation, right? It's not the appropriate time. But perhaps as you are kind of like building trust with the client in future meetings, if you think that this is a pattern, at some point you can suggest to the client, or you can ask to the client if they are interested in accessing to mental health therapy, and perhaps you can make that connection with the help of another colleague, or connecting them just directly to any pro bono resource or something like that. That would be also appropriate. Again, not during that moment or that conversation, but it could open the door in the future.
I see a couple of other questions, and I know we're coming up on time. So there's one very interesting question that touches on, for some young people who may end up in shady circles or drop out of school or experience a lot of challenges. What is the cost of that? Is it mainly trauma and the impact of it, or is it their character, caregivers, and whatnot? This is an excellent question, and I think it is a question that we need to have in terms of what are the elements at play that are leading this young person to engage with whatever situation in a particular manner. I have to say this, at least in the US context, the majority and the higher percentage of the clients that we work with are really exemplary young people. They are really resilient, very much trying to make it authentically, trying to live their best lives. I think that one of the main factors that may lead a young person to find refuge in circles that may not be the healthiest, or negative peers, for example, is the fact that it is difficult to acculturate or to integrate in a new environment. And many times, those that are the most welcoming, those that are the easiest to connect with, are the ones that may not have the best intentions in terms of their ability to provide friendship and or to engage in different things. And also, In terms of the school situation, many of the young people that we work with have interrupted schooling experience. They may present as a 16-year-old, but they actually have a third grade education because of how interrupted schooling was, especially if you are in a war-torn area or in a very vulnerable setting. And the perfect storm of all these things, I think it's all the points that you mentioned in your question and then some. Then we're talking about puberty, teenagers, and the challenges that may mean. We're talking about deficient school systems that do not know how to address the needs of, for example, learners of English, non-native speaker English learners, for example. There are many elements to it. Trauma plays a big part, as well as the other determinants, social, emotional determinants around them and the systems. I think one of the things that makes the biggest impact is making sure that the policies that and the supports to welcome these children are aligned with their needs. And also one of the pivotal roles is the role that you play as a mentor, as an anchoring adult figure that can be a sounding board for many things, in addition to just legal advice. I know that it sounds like a tall order, but just engaging with a young person and showing what a healthy, engaging relationship without having to engage with peers that are negative in any way can make a world of a difference and inspire a young person to truly try to live their best lives.